Speaking of leadership, okay, Ron Rivera for 3 straight years in Washington has struggled out of the gate. So you're talking about you had a 1-4 start this year. I believe it was a 2-5 start last year. The year where they won the NFC East at 7-9, it was like a 1-6 start. And then every single year, there's kind of a weaker quarterback that plays for them. Alex Smith in 2020, Taylor Heineke the last 2 years, that gets them back to about 500. Is that a frustrating thing when you're a general manager and you get all the hay in the barn, right? And the team always sort of starts out weaker, only to play well, right? They come true on their promise in the middle of the season, but expectations are so low because of how they start. What kind of culture does that build?
So that's an interesting thing. I think you saw that stat this year with the Ravens and how unbelievable they were in the preseason. Everyone thinks the preseason, who cares? We don't want to get our players injured. The tone that the preseason sets for a team is really important. Doesn't mean you always have to win. I get it. You really would like to come out ideally being right down the middle so that everyone's believing. Okay, so with Atlanta, we got into a run with that. And you know how I feel about Q, man. Dan Quinn is a hell of a football coach. Unfortunately, our preseasons always started off, we were 1s or 0s in the win column. And it gets ingrained in the mind, right? Trends start surfacing, people start talking about them, and then it takes you a while to build up. So let's switch back to Washington. I know that group is really aware of what you're referencing here. And that gets in their minds, and they start wondering, and they start searching, and they start looking. And with that sort of clawing for reasoning within a building, there starts to be some distractions. There starts to be a little bit of this. That's what you have to be very careful on. You can recover. To me, it's always been, I don't know how people believe, what they believe about this or feel about this. When you're kind of the behind guy, gal trying to catch up, it's a lot easier to play with your what do you call it? Something on fire, right? Just because you're not, the pressure's not on you. They're not, big expectations aren't that way. To get back up into the middle is easy. It's going past that, of course, that becomes more difficult. So I'm sure Ron has a really good grasp of what's going on here. And I'm sure it's frustrating the hell out of him, because this can start going to a spot where people start pointing. And if they start tailing off again and they end up right around that 500 spot, where do you go? Look what they're dealing with. I mean, they're bringing another quarterback this year. I don't know if you want to segue into Carson Wentz, but I mean, that is a big deal right now. All of this, including where they are with the quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. To bring a sports analogy, like if you're a cornerback, the goal is to be in such great position where you don't have to knock the ball away. If the ball's in the air, you've already lost. And so, yeah, it doesn't make, it makes you look great to dive and knock the ball away, but you were already losing by virtue of being targeted. And I think that's kind of an analogy here with them. They get behind, and we're all like praising them. Last year, they get back to 6-6, and it's like, but you had to use so much capital, yes, emotionally and all that kind of stuff just to get back. And then you don't have enough for down the stretch. Or in the case last year, they just had COVID and they just had, all these things that hurt them. In the year prior, it was, the late Dwayne Haskins, like he didn't have, and Alex Smith, the poor guy, had like an erector set in his leg. So when he goes 5-1 as a starter, he doesn't have it left in his leg to he couldn't even start the playoff game because he just didn't have it physically left. Right. So, whereas, some of these stronger teams, the Eagles and the Cowboys and they're going to sit their guys down in the second half of the year because they don't need every single game like it's life or death, the same way that Washington will, fighting and clawing for a playoff spot. I do think it's interesting. Taylor Heineke, not a great quarterback, but it is very clear that for what it's worth, he can lead that team and he can be somebody that they rally behind. And I do think that there's some value, and you see it even a little bit right now in Kirk Cousins in Minnesota, where, everybody knows Kirk is kind of not the greatest quarterback in the world, but every time they win, you can see the team trying to lift him up with the videos and all this stuff. Like, there are quarterbacks, and if you're a quarterback who's not the best quarterback in the world, you want to be that guy that the rest of your team roots for. And to me, I think that's who Taylor Heineke is. And I think even though he's clearly not the long-term answer, they themselves went out and got Carson Wentz as opposed to starting him again. I think that at least, for him, he's a guy that if you're going to sign as a backup, and Jacoby Brissett feels like the same. I think Jacoby Brissett's made himself $30 million this year just by how he's played. Now he's been a gamer this year for the Cleveland Browns. I think he really, I think guys like that are guys you can win with in the short term.
Eric, did you refer just on, was it emotional equity? Is that what you said?
Yeah, like an emotion. Yeah, just emotional equity that you have to. I mean, you only have so much, right?
If I can comment on that through some of the seasons that we were up and down in the years that I was in that seat, it is enervating, brother. You try to make it look like everything is fine, but there's a lot on your plate when you're trying to catch up. And not only 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year. When there's a trend of it, not to beat it to death, it is something that all of us with wanting to have that sort of analytic mind, like, well, but look what they're doing here. Look at how they're bridging the gap. But there is drain, and that building feels that drain when they're always trying to catch up instead of getting their asses out the gate strong, setting a tone, being, just having that presence about them. You have the owner on your side, because believe me, owners are very, very particular about that. They know the trends. May not be necessarily their finance guy in their other businesses. It may be their sons who are really dialed into PFF and saying, hey, Dad, there's something wrong with our football team. That's a little bit of tongue in cheek, of course.